All right. So here we go with part two of our critique of the paganism versus Platonism debate that had happened on the Pagan Revivalist Telegram channel. On the last video, which we'll link to, really just went through the opening statements and kind of broad general terms of what they're going to go over. And now we're going to get into more of the meat and potatoes of the actual debate between the two. I was hoping we could kind of separate some things out in here and, have it very clean and like, okay, here's his objections to the Republic and here's his objections to the problem of evil. But their conversation takes a more sort of meandering quality to it. So it's a little bit hard to piece out each individual thing. So I think we're going to start more after their opening statements and just go through it bit by bit. And I'll cut some stuff out. There's some parts where the Platonist guy S makes some responses, and I think I'll cut some of his stuff out so it's not redundant, so we're not saying the same things or different things on the Platonist side of the debate. But I'll include some of his stuff too, where it's relevant and where it makes sense for the conversation. So you'll hear a little bit of his stuff in there too. So we'll jump around. We'll try to keep it as succinct as we can. And I think in this one, we should have enough time to get through a lot of those objections that he brings up about the Republic that he kind of started in his opening statement, but then he gets more into the weeds with it. So we can get a little more into the weeds too and talk about it in a little more detail. So without further ado, let's kick this thing off. All right.
Okay, so I wrote a couple of notes here, and one of them is, I can't see the moon and sun as gods. I can't see the chariots. And this is a reason why Platonists often get associated with atheists.
So right here, this is something that S had mentioned, that he thinks Platonism is more rational because he can't imagine the sun being pulled by a chariot, or he can't imagine that the moon is literally a god when he knows it's a planet. And I think that's actually a really good point to make in a way, and it ends up kind of getting used against him here. But the point being that the way that we understand the gods in the myths as symbols is not the same way that we understand them as being, say, a symbol for a planet, right? And we do believe that the gods do have planetary bodies, right? So the sun is really the planetary body of Sol or Helios. We do see Jupiter as being the planetary body of the god Jupiter, and they have influence over the solar system. And this is a lot of what astrology is their influence over us as planetary bodies. And so we do have that kind of relationship there. And I ended up talking to us after the debate, and he shares that same view, but I don't think it got fully expressed in the debate in that way. It just kind of came off like he was saying that, it's just a planet kind of thing. So in Platonism, we do have this complex understanding of how planets relate to the gods. But there's a broader question here that he's bringing up about myth, but I'll let the Pagan Revival guy explain that.
Because instead of believing, they choose the words of the gods and the legends following traditional religion. What they do is they skin suit as traditional pious believers in order to infiltrate and corrupt from within.
Right. So his whole idea here is that the proper way to be a pagan and the proper way to believe in ancient religion is to accept the myths as the literal words of the gods and as divine revelations that we need to take as infallible truths. And so if they say that the sun is being pulled by a chariot in the sky, that's the literal truth. And that's what actually it is. And you're an atheist if you don't believe literally what it says in the myths. And this goes to the point of what I said in the last video, that this is really Protestant paganism. This is a Protestant sola scriptura mindset, that we need to interpret scripture, the scripture of the myths, as literally as possible and be sort of like mythical fundamentalists. And the reality is, you don't actually see this perspective in the ancient world at all. You see people talk about the myths all the time. You see people, trying to think about what it really means, understanding that there's a more symbolic nature to them. That's actually how they viewed them in the past, is in a more symbolic light. And this idea of viewing them as just literal stories and history books, you don't really find that opinion in the ancient world. So he's kind of grafting that onto the ancient world. And I think it's really more of like a modern biblical fundamentalist perspective on scripture, and then just projecting that onto people in the past.
And we see this all over the place, not just in pagan traditions, but also in Christianity. Aarvoll, in particular, is not very well liked in the Christian sphere because he chooses to reject a lot of things that Christians hold to be true. Why? Because, well, it's just not rational. In other words, he's not really a Christian. He's a Christian in name, but he's a Platonist pretending to be a Christian.
Yeah, I think this is a funny critique to make, because in the opening credits, or in the opening statements, we saw that he was criticizing that Platonism gets adopted by Christianity, and it gets adopted by Islam and Kabbalah and all of these other things, trying to sort of associate Platonism with those things. But here he shows the reality of the situation, which is that Christians are not Platonists. And if you are an actual Platonist, you're a heterodox Christian. You're going against Christian doctrine to be an open Platonist. And the same is true for other religions as well, that have adopted Platonic concepts. They always bring them into a different theology, and they kind of take bits and pieces of it. But there is a difference between Christians and Platonists. And that's a perfect example. They don't like him because he's a Platonist and he's not going by Christian doctrine.
And this isn't just Aarvoll. We notice that popes like Benedict and John Paul II being Platonists, self-avowed Platonists. And look at what damage they have done to the Catholic Church.
I mean, I've never heard of that, but it's kind of cool if they are. But I've never heard that.
In other words, Platonism, in the words of Plato himself in his Symposium, is a pharmacus. What is a pharmacus? It is a poison, but it's also a medicine. So in very low doses can be a medicine. But if you take too much, it will kill you.
Okay. So I find this interesting. I actually tried to find this reference to philosophy as a pharmacon in the Symposium, and I couldn't find that specific line that he's talking about. There is one in the Phaedrus where it's talked about, but not towards philosophy, but towards writing. So there is this one line. This is 274e. You can find this quote that goes, the story goes that Timaeus said to Thoth, both for and against each art, which it would take too long to repeat. But when they came to writing, Thoth said, O king, here is something that once learned will make the Egyptians wiser and will improve their memory. I have discovered a potion, it's a pharmacon, for memory and for wisdom, right? And this is Thoth, who's, like Hermes, gets associated with writing and communication. And basically they go on to say, hey, this is a great boon to mankind that we have this writing as a tool, but it's also going to make people in the end become less good at actually memorizing things for themselves. You got to remember, in the ancient world, people could memorize the entire Iliad and the Odyssey. This kind of like oral transmission culture was big, and writing is awesome for that reason, that we can write all of this stuff down and keep it for a long period of time. But it can also be a bad thing in that it makes us more reliant on these sort of outsourcing something that was previously in our minds alone and was like a skill. So there's that. I found that reference, but I haven't found this one specifically to philosophy. But I think we could apply it to it, and I don't necessarily think it means what he thinks it means. We could say if philosophy were a pharmacon, that makes a lot of sense to me. And not to say that a a lot of it's going to kill you necessarily, but it is something that can be misunderstood, and this goes to the idea of like sophistry. There are people out there who use kind of spurious reasoning, who call themselves philosophers, and they can actually lead people astray through the misuse or misunderstanding of philosophy. But used correctly, philosophy is a therapeutic and it is a medicine. So, not sure exactly what his overall point is.
Written about in the Symposium. So this is not my words. This is Plato's words, that philosophy is a poison. Now, you say that the guardians are only permitted not to have families because, quote, it would stop quarreling. Well, I ask you, before Plato, has there ever been a societal collapse without abolishing the family? Ever?
So this is such a funny question for him to bring up. It's just a weird way to frame it. But okay, has there ever been a societal collapse that before Plato's time, that didn't involve the collapse of the family first, or wasn't associated with the collapse of the family? Yeah, there's a ton of them. It really wasn't that hard to look these up. But it's a kind of a weird thing to put somebody on the spot for. But I'm just going to rapid fire these bad boys because it's pretty straightforward. The fall of the Mycenaean civilization is around 1200 BCE, before Plato here. So evidence suggests that infighting among the ruling elites in Mycenaean city-states like Mycenae, Pylos, and Tyrants contributed to the collapse. Competing claims to power, coupled with weak centralized authority, may have led to social instability and weakened the ability of the city-states to defend against external threats. The Akkadian Empire is the one of Sargon of Akkad. After the death of Naram-Sin, who styled himself as a god king, succession disputes and power struggles weakened the central authority. Local rulers, or ensi, began to assert autonomy, challenging the unity of the empire. The fall of the Old Kingdom in Egypt. Power struggles among provincial governors, or nomarchs, and weakened pharaonic authority led to political fragmentation. The fall of the Hittite Empire. Internal dynastic struggles and disputes over succession destabilized the central authority. The Harappan civilization in the Indus Valley. While evidence of internal conflict is limited, some scholars hypothesize that power struggles among regional elites might have contributed to the decline of urban centers and social cohesion. So here's just a couple random ones that from before Plato that we can see, yeah, there were examples of infighting that did cause societal collapses. So, and even in Herodotus, you see the same thing. You see these kind of powerful families fighting all the time and vying for power. So it's like, to try to act like this is just some ridiculous thing that never actually happens in reality is him being obtuse, I think.
You could just say yes or no.
Wait, I didn't understand
Yes.
the question. Can you?
Before Platonism, has there ever been an instance of societal collapse because of families quarreling?
So, like we saw, yes. Yeah, there absolutely are these things. So, there you go. I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit.
So before Platonism, why hasn't any society collapsed because of this?
Like I just showed, there's a number of examples where this has happened.
If you think this is a serious problem as it is.
And that's pretty much it. Yeah, this is kind of a silly argument, and you can find a million examples of quarreling families before Plato causing societal collapses because of their fights for power. And this is really getting at the core of what the guardians are trying to protect against in Plato. Plato's trying to theorize this kind of idea of how you could have an elite class that doesn't do this. How would that be possible, where you don't have a city-state where it's these powerful families kind of fighting each other for power all the time? Could you create a situation where they're actually fully interested in the good of the state, not just the good of their own particular family or clan? It's a valuable question to be asking, I think, when we're talking about politics. So we'll go ahead and jump ahead to a little bit more where he starts getting into this abolishing the family idea in the Republic and address that directly.
More or less, but would abolishing the family actually would prevent this? We know, as a matter of fact, today. Now, you could take it with a grain of salt, of course, because these are modern studies, and modern studies are not necessarily as reliable as they used to be. But children who grow up without knowing their parents end up for the worse. This is pretty reliable. In fact, it's so reliable that it's a decent indicator as to whether somebody is going to be a success or a failure in life, is whether they grew up in a household with a father and mother.
Yeah, I've heard of those studies too. Basically, they show that having a mother and a father, an intact family without divorce or anything like that, tends to be a lot better for kids. Okay, so pretty straightforward stuff. But we're getting into these kind of criticisms that he has about the Republic, and we're almost past the point where it's just been accepted in the argument that that is what Plato was saying, that he was advocating for the abolition of the family. And so now we kind of have to go and address that directly. And so first off, we have to understand the full context of the Republic. And that's something in here that is just not being taken into account. Like, what are we actually talking about in the Republic? And we can actually look at examples from the Republic and get a better understanding of what the Republic is really about. And the big mistake he's making here is thinking that the Republic is a model for civilization, an actual model for civilization that Plato intended to do in reality, when by and large, it's a theoretical allegory for justice, and particularly justice in the soul of an individual person. And this is explicitly laid out in the Republic. He brings up a lot of things in Book 3 of the Republic, I think because that's part of Nietzsche's Twilight of the Gods critique is all about Book 3. But if you look at Books 2 and 4, which are the bookends of Book 3, it's talked about what they're talking about. They talk about Book 3, basically, like what they're about to do, this thought experiment. So let me show you those exact passages. So in Book 2, this is 368c. They start talking about, before they get into the whole Book 3 and explaining the guardians and this whole idea, they talk about it a little bit. They say, "The inquiry we are undertaking is no easy one, but calls for keen vision, as it seems to me. So since we are not clever persons, I think we should employ the method of search that we should use if, with not very keen vision, were bidden to read small letters from a distance, and then someone had observed that these same letters exist elsewhere larger and on a larger surface." So this is kind of a little allegory he's making. He's like saying, maybe we should find this kind of what we're looking for in a bigger example. And maybe if we see it in a big example and talk more broadly, maybe we can better apply this to a smaller scale. So they're talking about justice. And so he's saying, hey, what they're going to show here is that they're going to say, hey, maybe if we talk about justice as it exists in something big like a city, maybe we'll better understand how justice operates in an individual person. That's what the Republic is about here. So he goes on to say, we should have accounted it a godsend, I fancy, to be allowed to read those letters first and examine the smaller if they are the same. Quite so. But what analogy do you detect in the inquiry about justice? I will tell you it. I said, there is a justice of one man, we say, and I suppose also of an entire city. Assuredly, said he. Is not the city larger than the man? It is larger, he said. Then perhaps there would be more justice in the larger object and more easy to apprehend. Okay, so there's the whole beginning of this idea that they're going to say, hey, why don't we theorize what this city could be like and use it as a way to understand justice in the individual person, in an individual soul. And this is how all of the Platonists have understood the Republic from Plato onward, is that the whole thing is really more of an allegory for the soul, more than an actual political prescription that you should try to do in reality. And that's why really nobody did bother to try doing this. There's no examples that I know of where somebody really went for the exact prescriptions of the Republic. He mentions the Plymouth kind of idea, and that supposedly they were based on Platonic principles. I don't know why that would have been the case for them, but I kind of find that quote dubious. But even if they did, they clearly misunderstood what the point of it was. They could have looked at something like, Plato's laws, but they didn't. They decided that they were going to look at this allegory for the soul and apply that instead. It doesn't really make sense. So they go on to say, if it pleases you, let us first look at its quality, the quality of justice in states, and then only example it also in the individual, looking for a likeness of the greater in the form of the less. Okay, that's book 2. That's them talking about, before they get into this, they frame it up as, hey, we're going to talk about this theoretical city-state so that we can better understand justice in the individual. And if that wasn't enough for you, then in book 4, they return to this idea once they're done talking about all of these ideas of the guardians in book 3. And in 434d, they say this: let us not yet affirm it quite fixedly, I said, but it is this form, when applied to the individual man, accepted there also as a definition of justice, we will then concede the point. For what else will there be to say? But if not, then when we look for something else. But now let us work out the inquiry in which we supposed that if we found some larger thing that contained justice and viewed it there, we should more easily discover its nature in the individual man. So they're just reiterating the point that they made in book 2, that, okay, we've gone through this exercise and we're again looking at this idea of the bigger as a way to understand an individual man. So this is the whole idea that this is an allegory of the soul. It's very explicitly laid out. If you're actually reading the entire Republic, you get that this isn't meant to be an actual literal prescription. And they even say that they refer to it as a theory while they're talking about it as well. Let me see if I can find that one. Yeah, so they say here, this later in book 6, in 502c, they say, our present opinion then about this legislation is that our plan would be best if it could be realized, and that this realization is difficult, yet not impossible. So they acknowledge that this is not really like the most feasible plan. They do say it's possible, but it would be very difficult. And, the question about its difficulty has to do with what you would need to have in order to make this actually work. And guess what? They actually talk about that too. What would you actually have to have in order to make any of this stuff work? Well, you need philosopher kings. You basically need people who are almost like angelic human beings that have this dedication to rulership, are good rulers, but are also philosophically minded and willing to look at things in a more deep way. And so they say this explicitly in 473d. This is part of book 5. They say, there can be no cessation of troubles, dear Glaucon, for our states, or I fancy for the human race either, nor until this happens will this constitution, which we have been expounding on in theory, ever be put into practice within the limits of possibility and see the light of the sun. And what they're saying there is, this is just a theory. This would require there to be these philosopher kings that actually would be able to even begin doing this. And this even goes to some of the practical application of Plato's ideas. He wasn't just a political theorist or a philosopher in the theoretic sense. He did actually go to Syracuse and have some real life political experiences with Damascus II and Dion of Syracuse. And when he was there, he ran into this exact problem, this problem of not having philosopher kings. He was trying to teach Dionysius about philosophy and kind of turn him into a philosopher king. And the problem was, all that Dionysius really cared about was using philosophy for power. He wasn't really that interested in philosophy for its own sake or for the sake of wisdom. He just wanted more and more power and thought, maybe I can use this really smart guy here and get some information about humans so that I can, be a better tyrant. And Plato ends up walking away from this experience in Syracuse kind of jaded about a lot of political ideas and realizing that, there are big limitations to what people can do, that we don't live in a world full of philosopher kings, which makes a lot of these ideas, really unfeasible in reality. And, that's the truth of the matter. And that's when he leaves there. And one of the last books that Plato writes, it's the longest one of his works, it's called Laws. In Laws, he actually starts putting together real life prescriptions of what he thinks a state should look like. And that's the book that these people should be looking at. If they want to understand what Plato's political ideas are, they're best expounded in Laws, not in the Republic. And this is because, for one, the Republic is an allegory for the soul. It was never meant to be taken literally, although you could take some prescriptions from it and actually turn them into, real ideas. But that wasn't really the point of it. And he also went to Syracuse and he tried to get a philosopher king out of Dionysius there, and it didn't work out. And so he comes back and reflects on the entire experience and writes something that's a very practical manual for how to build a city, and that is Laws. And guess what? Laws is very, very different from what you see in the Republic, because it's real politics. It's more of a grounded thing. It's like got more similarities, honestly, to something like Aristotle's politics than it does to what we understand in the Republic. So let's let him continue, and then we'll chime in again.
So knowing that, and this kind of mirrors what I was talking about William Bradford, right? About Plymouth, the American colony of Plymouth, where they followed Platonic doctrine about abolishing private property, where the younger men objected to working twice as hard, but being paid as much as the older men. The older men didn't like being classed in labor with the young men, found it as a type of disrespect. And women complained that they were washing other men's clothes because all things were to be held in common. And William Bradford says that this was done by well-meaning people, but it shows the emptiness of the theory of Plato.
Yeah, I mean, that's Bradford's opinion, and I don't know. I've never heard of the Plymouth folks doing this specifically because they read the Republic and that was their idea. Maybe it was, but if it was, that's pretty stupid of them, because they could have read Laws, and Laws would have given them a much better idea of how to build a city. Why they would have chosen the Republic as their example for it just shows that they didn't really understand what the Republic's about, And also, I find this quote dubious just because the people who started Plymouth were Puritan Christians. And it just seems to me like, wouldn't you go off of the Old Testament? Wouldn't you go off of something that Moses said and, maybe the tribes of Egypt or something like that? Wouldn't that make more sense than trying to follow Plato's Republic? So I should have looked that quote up in more detail, but I'll take his word for it. But I just think it's a silly critique that, okay, so some people misunderstood the Republic and made a mess of their little adventure in America. Okay, that doesn't really mean anything.
And to solve this, what they did was they allotted each family their own plot of land to have their own responsibilities for their own family, going back to that traditional family model. And voila, what do you know? Plymouth took off.
Huh. Wow. God, that's such a good idea. That's such a really good idea, giving, every family their own plot of land. Well, it's a shame that Plato just never thought of anything quite like that, except he did. He talked about that in Laws, and that's actually a huge part of how the Laws works. So in Laws 737d, he says, of land we need as much as is capable of supporting so many inhabitants of temperate habits, and we need no more. And then it goes on to talk about how they give every family in this city in Laws a plot of land. And not only do they have a plot of land, but the land is considered sacred and belongs to them forever. They're not even allowed to sell that land. It's the land of the family, and it exists in perpetuity for that family. So in 741c in Laws, he says, first, the land is sacred to all the gods, and further, that prayers shall be made at the first, second, and third sacrifices by the priests and priestesses. Oh my God, is this traditional religion? Therefore, the man who buys or sells the house plot or land plot allotted to him must suffer the penalty attached to this sin. So in Laws, Plato's explaining that selling your land off is actually a sin. that the land is sacred to the gods, and it's your sacred duty to take care of it, and you can't just sell it off. It's sacred. And this idea was put into place in laws to prevent people accumulating massive amounts of land. So the idea being, like, you don't want to end up in a situation where one guy owns 75% of the land. And to prevent this, the whole idea is all about individuals within the state owning the land themselves. So there you go. You could just as easily say that the people at Plymouth went back to Plato's ideas after taking this sort of turn away from private property, because these are the ideas that we actually see in laws.
So Platonism in theory.
But Plato isn't saying to abolish the family for everyone. It's just with the philosophers, with the guardians.
Are you sure? Because in Timaeus it says that all. In fact, I will read the quote directly to you here. Hold on 1 second. Let me pull it up. The quote from Timaeus, and this is in the beginning, so you don't have to look very far. Quote, "For all wives and children were to be in common, to the intent that no one should ever know his own child, but they were to imagine that they were all one family."
Oh, wow. That sounds pretty damning. Well, it'd be a shame if we had Timaeus here and we could pull up the entire passage to understand the context of what they're talking about. So in Republic, it's very explicit in Book 3 that what they're talking about is the guardians. And that's why this pagan revival guy has to resort to Timaeus to try to find a quote to support his ideas. And let me just read it to you, because let's see if this holds water, that he's saying everybody in this society in the Republic is supposed to have this as a characteristic. So we're just going to read the whole passage here. So this is Timaeus 18. And Socrates says, "That's because I think we said the guardians' souls should have a nature that is at once both spirited and philosophical to the highest degree, to enable them to be appropriately gentle or harsh as the case may be." "Yes," says Timaeus. Socrates goes on, "What about their training?" I want you to really pay attention to the pronouns here. So they says, "What about their training?" So we're talking about the guardians' training, right? Because that's what we were talking about in this passage. We're talking about the guardians specifically, right? Socrates said, I think we said the guardians' souls, right? So their training, we're talking about the guardians' training. Didn't we say that they, the guardians, were to be given both physical and cultural training, as well as training in any other appropriate fields of learning? We certainly did. Yes, and we said, I think, that those who received this training shouldn't consider gold or silver or anything else as their own private property, like the professionals they are. They should receive from those under their protection a wage for the guardianship that's in keeping with their moderate way of life. So we're talking about the guardians still, the guardians' way of life. And we said that they, the guardians, should share their expenses and spend their time together, live in one another's company, and devote their care above all to excellence. Now that they were relieved of all other occupations, yes, we said that as well. And in fact, we made mention of women. We said that their natures should be made to correspond with those of men, and that all occupations, whether having to do with war or other things or other aspects of life, should be common to both men and women. That too was discussed. And here we get to it, 18d. And what did we say about the procreation of children? We couldn't possibly forget that subject, because what we said was so unusual. We decided that they, the guardians, should have all spouses and children in common, and that schemes should be devised to prevent any one of them from recognizing his or her own particular child. Every one of them would believe that they all make up a single family, and that all who fall within their own age bracket are their sisters and brothers, and those who are older who fall in an earlier bracket are their parents and grandparents. Right. Okay. So this just gets to a broader point about this guy in general, about a lot of the people that are criticizing Plato in this way. I can't believe that he would use this as a quote and try to think that it actually says what he thinks it says. There's really only a couple ways that this falls out. Like, either this guy just has not read the source material at all and couldn't even be bothered to read Timaeus 18. He just had to go to this particular line in Timaeus, take it out of context, and then go, nope, see? That he says everybody has to do this. When clearly, if you just read, all you have to read is 18. You don't have to read the whole of Timaeus. Just read the rest of the passage that this comes from. And it's crystal clear that he's talking about the guardians. He's not talking about everybody. He's just talking about the guardians. So either this guy is just cherry picking this stuff. Maybe he's getting them off of, like, I don't know, Twitter posts or something like that out of context. But it's hard for me to believe that he actually read this passage. And if he did actually read this passage and that's what he took from it, he either has terrible reading comprehension or he's just being genuinely malicious and dishonest and trying to drag Plato through the mud by putting words in his mouth that he never said. So this is a total nonsense one. And really, if you ever hear anybody saying, oh, well, in Timaeus, he says it's for all people, pull up 18d and ask him, hey, why don't you read the whole passage and tell me what it actually says? Because that's not what it says. He's talking about the guardians.
Those who were within a suitable limit of age would be brothers and sisters. Those who were of an elder generation, parents and grandparents, and those of a younger generation, children and grandchildren. He says all. He doesn't say just the guardians, bro.
Okay, well, it might be some kind of interpretation of that, or some kind of, like, because everywhere online I read, it's like specifically it talks about the guardians being the ones who are sort of subjected to this.
Yeah, and S is completely right in this one, that, yeah, everybody looks at it as it's just the guardians because that's what it is. And even that quote from the Timaeus actually is, I would use that to support our argument, to say, no, he reiterates in Timaeus that it's specifically about the guardians, not about everybody.
But
correct.
Even if I can see to the point,
lower classes? What were the lower classes subjected to? They were subjected to arranged marriages, right? So
isn't this funny? So he goes from this saying, nope, it was all of people have to do this with the guardians, where it's everyone's held in common, and then immediately goes, and the lower classes had arranged marriages. Well, which one is it? Is it they're all held in common because that quote applies to all of them, or do they have arranged marriages? Which one is it? Like, he's saying two separate things. It's like almost like he's admitting immediately. He's like, yeah, that was nonsense. It was actually arranged marriages for everybody. He's going to go into the arranged marriage idea. I'll see if he has any more to say.
That's like the main draw of Platonism. Everybody gets a waifu, bro.
Yeah, everyone gets a waifu. It's funny that he's criticizing this because, if you want to talk about like traditional societies, arranged marriage is the norm. Like that, even today in Hindu culture, arranged marriages are much more normalized than they are in the West. And honestly, through most of Western history, most marriages were arranged to some degree. People didn't just, fall in love at a bar and, then get married or whatever. Like, that wasn't really how the ancient world worked. A lot of people had arranged marriages or were sort of betrothed to people for long periods of time and then eventually married. That's the norm of the ancient world. And the idea of like free love, like you're going to go out and like find your soulmate or whatever, isn't really a part of traditional religion. It's not really a part of the traditional understanding of marriage even. Marriage is a contract because it's uniting these two families together. And yes, a lot of these things were arranged. So I don't know, like that. He's going to go on and basically critique the traditional understanding of marriage, which is kind of odd because his whole thing is that Plato's supposedly anti-traditional.
But this was done behind the scenes. They would choose, the upper classes would choose wives and husbands and pass it off as though it were like a lottery, right? In order to eugenically breed a more loyal, subservient subclass.
Yeah, so he's talking about the ideas in the Republic here. But why, to get a little bit more clarity on what Plato actually thinks marriage should be, why don't we just go ahead and look at laws? Because laws actually talks about this very specifically. And what he says is actually a lot more closely aligned with what Aristotle says in the first 5 chapters of his Politics. So in starting their conversation, it's interesting. In laws, this is the first laws they start talking about. And because laws actually has literal laws and prescriptions for what they should do, like laws about how to handle particular things. And the first laws that they start talking about are laws of marriage. So in 721a of laws, they say, does not the starting point of generation in all states lie in the union and partnership of marriage? Clinius says, certainly. And the Athenian says, so it seems that if the marriage laws were the first to be enacted, that would be the right course in every state. And he goes on to say, not advocating an arranged marriage necessarily, but he does say, let's see, lest he imagine that a single life brings him gain and ease, and he shall have no share in the honors which are paid from time to time by the younger men in the state to their seniors. Basically, this is a part of a passage where Plato goes on to say that it's an obligation of every man to get married by the age of 35, that you have to get married. It's not a choice in the state, really. It's like you're going to get married by the time you're 35. You can figure out how you're going to do that. It's a matter for your family to figure out. It's not going to be arranged by the guardians of the state, but you can figure it out for yourself. But you got to get married by 35. And if you don't, there's going to be problems. For example, like what I just read here, that if you decide that a single life is better and going to bring you gain and ease, the kind of person who's like, I make enough money, I don't need kids, they're just going to take away my time and energy and money and blah, that kind of mentality, Plato says those guys don't get a role in the state anymore. We just kind of push them off to the fringes. They have to pay a fine because they never had kids and never got married. And on top of that, they're not going to get state honors. So they're not going to get positions of power. They're not going to get these higher level honors from the state. They lose their essentially what's like kind of like a social security there, like any kind of money that they would get from the younger generations. But you don't get that anymore. You're on your own. You want to live a life like you're not a part of a state and you don't have a duty and obligation to make children and have a family. Cool. You can beat it. You can go be by yourself then, right? That's the idea. So this is very far from what this guy is representing in the Republic. And these are the actual political ideas of Plato, not the stuff that's theorized in the Republic.
In other words, they wanted to eugenically produce slaves with a slave mindset.
I think S is going to come up with a good response to this, but it is true that this guy is like, he's very much picking and choosing the kind of stuff that he wants to be upset about when it comes to this stuff. When he wants to be a traditionalist, he's a traditionalist. And then when he wants to be, like a libertarian about these ideas, then all of a sudden he morphs into a libertarian. And so it's like, very, very inconsistent as far as his ideas go with all of this stuff. So let's continue on a little bit. And this might be getting close to the end of his kind of remarks on the Republic, but we can kind of wrap up and I've got a couple extra things that we can talk about.
No, I don't think so. I think they genuinely cared about their society, wanted it to be better. Like if you,
that's what they think. And I'm sure that the Soviets,
but if you're against LGBT and trans and race mixing and all this crap, like wouldn't you also want to teach people, hey, this is wrong? Like if you believe this, you will face negative social consequences. Like you will serve your nation and your people, and we're gonna put legal implements and social, informal and formal, implements to make sure that this happens. Like it's like you want to criticize Platonism from a libertarian angle when it suits you, but then when Platonism is actually based, it's like you just kind of don't.
No, because it's utilizing the mindset of a nerd, and that's really the crux of Platonism in practice. What does it want to bring about? It wants to bring about a world where the nerds, the philosopher kings, are in charge.
I just think it's so funny that he just criticizes the uh, the guardians as being nerds, and like that's his main disagreement, is that they're nerds. I think this is just a good example. Like he doesn't really have a very strong argument here about against what S just said. He just goes into calling these guys nerds, and it's like, what's nerdy about a philosopher king? I don't think the idea of a philosopher king is nerdy at all. The idea of a wise king, isn't that the ideal that we've always had? Do you want an irrational king? Do you want a dumb king? Do you want a dull tyrant? Or do you want a wise philosopher king? I don't really get the idea of calling these guys nerds. So that's more or less the substantive parts of his ideas in the Republic, and I think we covered a good chunk of it. That there are good reasons for why these ideas were brought about in the Republic, as one, as an allegory for the soul, but two, as a legitimate way to try to stave off the kind of fighting in families, that kind of societal collapse idea. We see that there's good reason and direct evidence that this was meant more as an allegory for the soul. We touched on this quote that he brings up in the Timaeus that's just complete garbage and taken out of context. And also see that if we want a better and clearer understanding of what Plato's ideas are about family and land and private property and all of those things are available in laws. And there's a ton of great quotes in there that you can pull and find, like the ones I mentioned, if anybody's trying to say that this isn't the case, or or trying to pull what he's pulling and make it seem like Plato was explicitly advocating all of the ideas in the Republic, which is just not the case. I'm going to see too if there's any other quotes that I pulled up that I want to address, because there was a couple things that he said in his opening statement that I kind of wanted to readdress. So for those that have read that, I'll give a quick summary, or those who haven't seen it, I'll give a quick summary, and then I'll pull up a couple quotes for it. But one thing, talking about this whole idea of anti-family. There's another great quote in there where I think I mentioned in the last video about how we should really treat our parents as living gods. And that's sort of the greatest thing we can emulate, is looking at our old parents and in their old age and really worshiping them as living ancestors and living gods. And that quote is in 931d. So if you guys want to look that up, if you ever get this thrust on you, it's a good thing to do. So he says in there, "Let us maintain then, as we said a moment ago, that in the eyes of the gods, we can possess no image more worthy of honor than a father or forefather laid up with old age, or a mother in the same condition, whom when a man worships with gifts and honor, God is well pleased, for otherwise he would not grant their prayers." So, he basically refers to them like they're living shrines. So, clearly this is not an anti-family thing. He's saying you should worship your ancestors, you should worship your parents. He agrees with the having marriage as a central part, one of the first things to have as a part of society. So none of that makes sense. There's private property in here. There's lots of things that he says about land, like I had mentioned before. The restrictions on buying and selling land. And then one other thing that he mentioned too was about constitutional, sort of like the constitution of the state. He goes on at some points randomly in this to talk about how Plato's like an authoritarian, right? And it's all about censorship and authoritarianism. And again, this is something that we see in laws just isn't the case. We actually see the early precedents of creating this sort of balance of powers that we see in modern governments today, like the U.S. government. So specifically in 756e of laws, he says, "The selection of officials that is thus made will form a mean between a monarchic constitution and a democratic, and midway between these our constitution should always stand." And then in 757d kind of goes on about that idea and says, "And whoever founds a state elsewhere at any time must make this same object the aim of his legislation, not the advantage of a few tyrants, or of one, or of some form of democracy, but justice always." So this idea that he's like advocating for just like total authoritarianism is just not correct. In Laws, we seem very explicitly saying, no, like this, you need to have a balanced constitution. You do need to have a sort of monarchic leadership. You need to have an aristocracy, and you need to have a democracy. You need to have each one of these components in balance, and that's what justice is. Justice is the balance between those interests: the interests of the people, the interests of the nobles, and the interests of the supreme sovereign, you could say, or the highest seat in the government. So that's basically what we have today. That's the Republic. That's the ancient Roman Republic, is that idea of the balance of powers. And it's here, right in Plato, if you actually want to read what Plato really thought in Laws. So I want to take one more thing to address on all of this, just kind of in a broad sense when we're talking about the Republic, that, the idea of the guardians is actually something that has been tried to some extent before. And this never really gets brought up in here, but I want to pull it up as kind of the ideal, or the closest thing to the ideal of the guardians that's ever happened in reality. And that is the idea of medieval monasteries. That's probably the closest thing in reality that we have to the idea of the guardians. And when you really think about it, it's like, what are monasteries? You have these people who, they don't have children, they don't have families, they live in common, calling each other brothers and sisters, right? And they live a simple life, an austere life. They don't have any possessions. Everything that they own is in common with one another. They don't have any private possessions beyond, like a robe and a rosary, maybe a few effects here and there. But more or less, they live this sort of life of, you might call it poverty, but it's just not based in material possessions at all. And they even they did guide society in some sense in the Middle Ages. The monasteries were a very strong fixture in European life in the Middle Ages. This is where they were centers of learning. They preserved all of this information from the ancient world. Granted, you could say Christians destroyed it too, but they did actually preserve it at these monasteries. And they lived this kind of lifestyle that is somewhat like the Republic. It's not exactly the same, because obviously they don't have families and they're not rulers of the society or anything like that. They were more pulling themselves away from the world. So there are pretty big differences, I would say, between what the guardian idea is versus medieval Christian monasteries. But I think that is actually the closest idea that you could get to it. The closest idea in reality, at least, is something along the lines of what the monasteries were. And I think we can start to understand the logic of what Plato was kind of thinking, is trying to create a group of people that were solely focused on the good and didn't have any other impediments in their life to prevent them from pursuing the good and being the best possible leaders that they could be. Again, I think this is all theoretic, but it's about justice. This is how and the reason why I bring this up is this is how it relates to the idea of justice. They're saying this is this hypothetical, like, hey, if we had a society like this, wouldn't that produce some people who are kind of as just as they possibly could be? And how could we relate that idea to the individual? That's really what the Republic is all about, okay? And we see that playing out in other religions too, that have these kind of monastic orders, right? Buddhism's no different. Buddhism has a strong monastic tradition. There's a strong monastic tradition in Hinduism. And that's really the closest thing in reality that we get to something like guardians is monks, more or less. The big difference being, obviously, in Plato's world, those people should have a more pronounced role in society, a stronger role in society. And they should have that stronger role because they don't have any conflicting interests. You're not going to bribe a monk, right? That's the idea. You're not going to bribe a guardian. But obviously there's some significant differences, where monks aren't political. They're not political leaders. And it's not a perfect one-to-one. But I bring it up because I think it's an interesting way to think about it. When you look at the different monastic orders, I think that's the closest in reality we get to guardians. But either way, it's an allegory for the soul. And if you really want to understand what the Republic is about, you got to read Laws. I know it's really long, but that is going to be your best bet for understanding the deeper aspects of what's going on in Plato's Republic and what his ideas about law really are.